There it is, with a handshake and a deal. That is Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un signing off on their centerpiece summit declaration. The agreement commits Trump and Kim to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But Trump is revealing another deal that the two leaders struck after that signing ceremony. He says the U.S. will suspend military exercises with South Korea. He calls them very expensive and very provocative to Kim. It's a surprise announcement this morning, and it's drawing a lot of attention.
Starting that process very
I'm going to bring in Abraham Denmark. Now, he's the director of the Asia program at the Wilson Center. He's also a former Pentagon official, and we reached him in Silver Spring, Maryland. Let's talk about this first, sir, but what we're going to listen to is a clip of the president talking about the suspension of those exercises. Have a listen.
I want to bring our soldiers back home. We have right now 32,000 soldiers in South Korea, and I'd like to be able to bring them back home, but that's not part of the equation right now. At some point, I hope it will be, but not right now. We will be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, unless and until we see that the future negotiation is not going along like it should.
Okay, Mr. Denmark, we've all heard that again. I'm sure you heard it early this morning when it was first made by the president. What do you think?
Well, it's pretty surprising. The fact that exercises are on the table is actually not very new. The United States has in the past paused or even canceled exercises in order to set groundwork and set a good environment for negotiation. But the fact that the president referred to them as provocative was quite surprising. That's been the language that China and North Korea have used. Also, it appears that North Korea is getting the suspension of exercises without giving anything in return. The president just saying that we're going to freeze these exercises until North Korea stops engaging in this diplomatic process really is a pretty major concession, especially considering, at least right now, North Korea hasn't given anything in response. As I mentioned, we did this in 1992 with an exercise called Team Spirit, which led to North Korea agreeing with the United States, signing agreements with the IAEA, and laid the framework for the agreed framework in 1994. So it remains to be seen if that happens again, but for now, it seems like a pretty major concession.
Now, we're understanding, including from our Asia correspondent, Sasha Petrusik, who is there reporting on this, that this agreement to suspend these military exercises may have been done without informing South Korea. What are the implications of that?
Well, it's going to raise a lot of concerns, I expect, in South Korea, especially among the conservatives in South Korea, who traditionally have been a source of great support for the alliance in South Korean politics. But even in the Blue House, even with the current government in Seoul, I expect that there's a lot of concern and hesitancy about what this may mean. In the past, when the United States has raised the possibility of withdrawing troops, Kissinger did that at one point, President Carter talked about that at one point. It raised tremendous concerns in South Korea. In fact, there's some evidence that South Korea's indigenous nuclear program really came out of concerns of American abandonment. My expectation is that the current government in Seoul is going to run with this agreement, is going to try to improve inter-Korean relations on that basis. But at the same time, I expect there's a lot of nervousness about American commitment and about the predictability and reliability of the United States, especially in the coming months.
Let's look at the agreement overall. Is it possible at this point to determine if there's an overall winner?
Well, there's still a lot that remains to be seen. I think immediately, China and North Korea are clearly the winners, in that North Korea got a tremendous amount of legitimacy. Kim Jong-un can show his people that he has sat down with the leaders of the world. He can show that the North Korean flag is side by side with the flag of the United States, and gets a tremendous amount of legitimacy as well as being able to point to the suspension of those exercises. But that does not necessarily mean that the United States has lost. A lot will depend on what happens next. There's still going to be a diplomatic process. They pointed to meetings even next week between the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor and their North Korean counterparts to build on the agreement and the joint statement that was made today. So if we're actually able to move down that diplomatic process, this is the beginning. But for now, there's a lot of talk of trust, not a lot of talk of verification. And when it comes to countries like North Korea, trust is something that is quite dubious.
As you say, dubious. You've studied this, you've followed this, you know the history of deals with North Korea. Do you trust them moving forward?
No. With the Soviet Union, President Reagan's statement was trust but verify. I think for now the way going forward should be to distrust and verify. North Korea has made agreements in the past. In fact, yesterday to the day was the 25th anniversary of the original statement on denuclearization between the United States and North Korea. So we've been down this road before. North Korea is committed to denuclearizing in the past. The United States has offered assurances in the past. And yet here we are. North Korea has made tremendous progress in its nuclear weapons and its ballistic missiles. So I think there's very little basis for trust right now. Hopefully through diplomacy we're able to build that, but we have a very long ways to go.
As you say, potentially the Chinese and the North Koreans pleased about this. The South Koreans maybe a wait and see. Let's talk about the Japanese as well. Part of the six-party talks, the missiles that have been fired have in a number of cases gone over Japanese territory. Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister, has really tried to cultivate Donald Trump leading up to this. How do you think the Japanese are going to react moving forward?
I think right now Japan is breathing a bit of a sigh of relief in that nothing terrible happened. But at the same time, I think there's also a great deal of nervousness still in Japan. The fact that President Trump was willing to give away these exercises, has talked about the withdrawal at some point of U.S. troops from Korea, would make, I expect, Japan very anxious. So we've seen Prime Minister Abe engaging President Trump very directly, very heavily, and on a very regular basis. And I expect we're going to see that continue. In my experience, when the government of Japan is giving you a big bear hug and talking about how close you are, how much they love you, that really shows to me how nervous they are. And we've been getting a lot of love from Japan lately. So I think they're very nervous, and I think they're going to be watching very closely about what happens now, worried about the United States giving concessions and wanting to make sure that whatever happens on Korea does not necessarily translate to changes in U.S. force posture, U.S. commitments, U.S. exercises with Japan.
Yet another player to watch as this agreement and the talks that result from that play out. Abraham Denmark, I want to thank you so much for your time on this.
My pleasure.
Abraham Denmark is the director of the Asia program at the Wilson Center, and he joined us from Silver Spring, Maryland. Reaction to this morning's summit is pouring in from leaders around the world. South Korean President Moon Jae-in posting a statement on Twitter this morning saying this: "It is a great victory achieved by both the United States and the two Koreas, and a huge step forward for people across the world who long for peace." Once again, I'd like to pay my respect to President Trump, who achieved a feat that no one else has ever delivered. Chairman Kim Jong-un will also be remembered as a leader who made an historic moment by taking the first bold step toward the world. Finally, he went on to say this: "As the President of the Republic of Korea, promise to make all-out efforts to help establish permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula and to usher in a new era of coexistence and prosperity." Let's bring in for more reaction on this, John Park. Now, he's the director of the Korea Working Group at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He watched the events unfold early this morning and joins us now from our Washington bureau. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Park. Let's first off get your overall impressions of this deal.
Sure. If we look at it in terms of a ledger, John, on the one side, what was expected, we were looking for a joint statement, and that's what we got. And within that joint statement, we saw the North Koreans pledging to work towards denuclearization, the United States laying out some of the security guarantees being the core elements. The other piece of this is we're expecting the official launch of a denuclearization mechanism, this process that President Trump was talking about going into this meeting. On the other side of the ledger was almost the off-the-cuff type of remark that's still being factored in, but President Trump also put on the table potential cancellation, suspension of U.S. South Korean military exercises as a way to be a catalyst to get North Korea to really move forward fast on some of the denuclearization aspects. So one way to sum it up is the expected aspects. They were quite clear, and we saw movements early on. Secretary Pompeo in his meeting with Chairman Kim talking about what may be the outlines of a broad agreement, and then these other statements that are coming up that are catching a lot of the allies by surprise, and we'll see how this is factored in terms of the game plan going forward.
Let's unpack all of that a little more. Let's look at the text of the agreement, especially that third clause that seems to be getting all the headlines there. And there it is there. DPRK commits to work towards complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Now, there's a couple of things that jump out for me there, not the least of which is he's talking about the entire peninsula, and the word irrefutable and verifiable is not in there as well. What do you think of the actual language of that?
There were gaps going into this, John, and I think this idea that given the time available, the inability to close those gaps in a way that were definitive, but the political decision being made that it was important to get this overall statement out and try to move forward and try to narrow the gaps as they launched this denuclearization mechanism. Secretary Pompeo, after the second meeting with Chairman Kim, mentioned that the United States would be launching a process, and I think those were the early managing expectations, that we weren't going to see a definitive breakthrough in Singapore, but rather the beginning of a process. So optimists are framing it as it's great that we are now at least in this category of working in this process type of setting. Others are saying that these details are critical and they could potentially sow the seeds for misunderstanding and the derailment of this process in a short period of time.
You also talked about the aspect of the cessation of what the president calls sort of expensive war games. That seems to be a surprise to the South Koreans, who rely on America's military presence and the readiness that those war games provide. How much of a problem will that be going forward, not necessarily for the North Koreans, but for, say, the Japanese and the South Koreans?
Well, these are treaty alliances that the United States has with South Korea and with Japan. And the U.S. forces in South Korea, U.S. forces Japan, critical elements in providing and supporting their allies when it comes to their conventional defense, and also through something called extended nuclear deterrence, essentially enjoying the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. As it pertains to South Korea, though, there is mandatory military service. It's about 14 months now, and South Korean military conscripts have one chance at having a full-scale military exercise with their American counterparts to prepare for, if it were to happen, a war with North Korea to repel a North Korean attack. So there is concern from the military professional perspective that South Korea, if we have this type of suspension of military exercises, South Korean forces will not have that opportunity to practice.
Can we talk winners and losers here? If there was a percentage for the takeaway for both those leaders, is there someone who came out with more?
Well, this is a part where if we look at it from the outside, what the United States is pledging to do is a little more concrete. What the the North Korean side is looking to do is a little more aspirational. I think that's one way to frame it. But what's key here is that the two leaders will be evaluating themselves very subjectively. And if you look at the preparation that went in on particularly the North Korean side, a lot of it was scripted. Even when Kim Jong-un was on the ground in Singapore, a matter of a few hours later, photos of his walkabout in Singapore were posted on the front pages of the Nodong Shinmun, the North Korean state newspaper. So from that perspective, I think it's this idea that it's very subjective, and that's how the two leaders are going to move forward in terms of how they're going to sell it to the respective groups back home.
The pessimists have damned the deal. The optimists say it's a good step towards the future. What's the process like now?
It is very difficult, very complex. Previous U.S.-North Korea agreements have floundered on verification and inspection. And so this is a part where, as much as these agreements are helpful to begin and to send the right positive messages, the idea of verification and inspection is something that's going to require multilateral cooperation. And that's a big question mark. That's a big unknown right now, because what we've seen in terms of this U.S. administration, there's a keen preference on bilateral engagements. So there is a learning curve aspect involved here as well. But once we see more details about verification and inspections, that's an area where we can recalibrate in terms of the likelihood of these type of breakthroughs continuing.
So still potentially a long, uncertain road ahead.
That's right.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
John Park is the director of the Korea Working Group of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and he joined us from our Washington bureau.